I was standing in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just another message from the pharmacy maybe, or a reminder for my dentist appointment. But when I picked it up and saw the name Mark, my husband of 32 years, I felt a strange, cold pull in my stomach. We hadn't spoken much the last few weeks. He'd been distant, restless. But nothing prepared me for what I read next. I'm leaving you and moving to Los Angeles with my 20-year-old babe. I've already emptied our joint account. Haha. That was it. No explanation, no face-to-face conversation. Just a cruel, smug message from the man I had built a life with, raised children with, and cared for through every chapter of our shared life. I stood there frozen for a moment, my heart pounding but not breaking. Not yet. I read it again, just to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. My eyes didn't lie. The words were real. He'd not only left me, but laughed about it. Laughed about robbing me of what we'd saved together. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even feel angry right away. I felt calm. Strangely calm. I stared out the window at the bird feeder Mark had put up 5 years ago, and the blue jays that still visited every morning like clockwork, as if nothing had changed. I replied simply, "Good luck." He didn't answer. I didn't expect him to. He'd probably already packed his designer luggage and hopped on a flight with her, some girl young enough to be our daughter. Maybe she laughed with him as he typed that message. Maybe she thought it was funny too, but what he didn't know was what I had done 2 weeks before that text arrived. You see, I had seen it coming. Not this exact moment, not the ridiculous 20-year-old or the account draining, but the pulling away, the late nights, the lies about work dinners that didn't exist. I had my suspicions, and for the first time in our long marriage, I followed my gut instead of waiting for things to fall apart on their own. I'd gone to the bank. Quietly, I opened my own account. I moved half of everything. Not illegally, not in anger, but as a woman preparing herself for what she couldn't yet name. I didn't touch his side. I let him think he still had control. But what he believed was our joint account had already been split. He could only drain what he thought was mine. After that, I hired a lawyer. A quiet, kind woman named Ellen who'd handled my friend Rachel's divorce last year. We met in the back of a coffee shop, like something out of a spy movie, and I told her everything I knew, everything I suspected. Ellen nodded and listened and helped me draft the documents, just in case. So when the message came, my hands didn't tremble. I'd already prepared the papers. What he also didn't know was that the house wasn't just ours anymore. I'd refinanced it under my name, thanks to a loophole I'd found through my lawyer's advice. The equity was mine now, legally. He could run, but there was nothing left for him to take. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. 32 years, and now silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that hurt. It was peaceful, freeing. I poured myself a glass of wine and listened to the clock ticking, remembering all the times he'd told me I'd be nothing without him. I smiled. The next morning, I got a call from my daughter, Laura. I hadn't told her yet. She was always so protective of me after her father started pulling away. I didn't want to worry her, but now there was no hiding it. "Mom, is it true?" she asked. Her voice was shaking. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently. "It's true, but I'm all right." She was silent for a long time. Then I heard her voice crack. "He left you? For real? And with someone my age?" I could feel her pain more than my own. "Yes," I said, "but I'm okay. Really. He didn't take everything. He just thinks he did. Laura drove down that same day. We sat on the porch for hours, talking, crying, remembering. She asked me questions I hadn't asked myself yet. What now? What do you want to do next? That was the hardest part. I didn't know. I had spent most of my adult life being someone's wife, someone's mother. I had never been just me. Later that week, Mark tried to call. I let it ring. I already knew what he'd found out. That the account was not full. That he didn't own the house. That his smug little escape plan wasn't so clever after all. He sent a text. Just one word. Why? I didn't reply. He'd made his choice. Now I was making mine. But what came next? Even I couldn't have predicted. 2 weeks passed without another word from Mark. The silence wasn't strange, it was expected. What was strange was how light I felt. Not happy, not yet, but free. Like someone had cut loose a weight that had been quietly crushing me for years without me even realizing it. The days felt longer, but not in a painful way. I filled them with simple things, reading the books I never had time for, sitting out in the garden with my coffee, calling old friends I hadn't spoken to in ages. I even started baking again, just for myself. I didn't need anyone to eat the cookies or compliment my cooking. I just needed the smell in my house, the warmth of something homemade. Laura visited every weekend, insisting I wasn't going to be alone through this. She'd bring over groceries, little gifts, even flowers, and while I appreciated her so much, I also knew I had to figure things out for myself. I had to learn how to stand on my own again. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address. The handwriting was Mark's. Neat. Familiar. My fingers shook slightly as I opened it, less from fear, more from the old echo of habit. For years, his moods determined mine. Now, he couldn't touch my peace. The letter wasn't long. He said he was in Los Angeles, but things hadn't gone as planned. The 20-year-old babe, as he'd so charmingly put it, had drained his new account within days of arriving, took his watch, his wallet, even his phone. He'd had to buy a cheap replacement just to message me. She said she loved the idea of me, he wrote. Not me. Not really. I sat back in my chair, letting the words hang there. Mark had spent so many years warning me not to trust people, not to depend on others, not to be too emotional. He had built walls around us, then resented me for living inside them. Now, those same walls had collapsed on him. He ended the letter with a plea. If there's any way to fix this, I'd come back. We could start over. I was wrong. Please. I folded the letter slowly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer. I didn't need to burn it. I didn't need to respond. The silence between us said enough. That night, as I sat on the back porch watching the stars, I thought about all the years I'd put myself second. All the birthdays I made about him. The holidays I spent pretending everything was okay for the kids. The dreams I packed away neatly in boxes labeled, maybe someday. And then I thought about what it meant to start over. Not with someone, but as someone. I called Ellen the next morning. My lawyer. She sounded bright, upbeat, like she had been waiting for this call. "We're ready whenever you are," she said. I filed for divorce that afternoon. Mark still hadn't officially served me papers. He thought I'd be too broken to respond, too paralyzed by grief to fight back. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was awake. Fully, completely awake for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, I began to reclaim little corners of my life. I changed the living room furniture around. I donated his old coats. I threw out the cologne that used to make me feel comforted and now only made me feel sick. And then something surprising happened. I started getting letters, not from Mark, but from women, friends of mine, neighbors, even one from a woman I hadn't spoken to since high school. Word had gotten out, through Laura, I suppose, that I had handled it with grace, that I'd stood up for myself. Some of the letters were simple. I'm proud of you. Others were heartbreaking. I wish I had done what you did when I had the chance. It turns out, I wasn't the only one who had been abandoned, betrayed, or overlooked. And I wasn't the only one who had stayed silent for too long. One letter stood out in particular. It was from my younger sister, Denise. We hadn't been close in years. Too much distance, too many unspoken things between us. But her letter was raw, honest. I thought you were the lucky one, she wrote. I thought you had it all. I was jealous. Now I realize you were just strong enough to make it look easy. I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner. I cried after that letter, not from sadness, but from relief. Someone had seen me, the real me, the woman who gave everything, the woman who was finally giving to herself. That weekend, Laura brought over an old box from the attic. Inside were photographs, journals, a few dusty dream boards I had made when I was barely 30. I had forgotten all about them. One of the boards had a picture of Paris on it. I laughed when I saw it. Me? In Paris? That had been such a silly, distant fantasy. But Laura didn't laugh. You should go, she said quietly. Why not? I stared at her, unsure. Alone? I asked. She smiled. Especially alone. For the first time in decades, the world felt wide open again. But Mark wasn't done yet. He called, then called again and again. Finally, I answered. His voice cracked on the other end. I'm sorry, he said. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. But it was already too late. The last time I heard Mark say, I'm sorry, was 10 years ago, and even then, it felt like he choked on the words. But this time, over the phone, his voice sounded different, small, like a man who had finally seen himself for who he really was. I sat quietly, listening to his apology. He talked about regret, about how he couldn't sleep at night, about how he kept seeing me in his dreams, me, the woman he left behind without a single conversation, just a cruel message and a laughing emoji. But I didn't interrupt him, because I had nothing to say. I had done my crying, my pleading, my forgiving. I had gone through every stage of grief alone in that house, with only the hum of the fridge and the tick of the wall clock for company. And somewhere along the way, I had found peace. The kind of peace that comes only after deep, wrenching heartbreak. Thank you for calling, I said softly when he finished. But I'm not coming back. And you're not coming home. There was silence on the other end. I could feel the weight of it. Who's with you now? He asked finally, like he was hoping I had someone else to blame this strength on. I smiled to myself. Me, I replied. Just me. I hung up. That phone call was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. Not the divorce papers, not the betrayal, but that moment when he realized I didn't need him to heal. In the following weeks, something shifted inside me. I found myself waking up earlier. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. I even changed the ringtone. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It was like I was cutting out every last thread that tied me to that version of my life. And then came the real turning point. One rainy Thursday afternoon, as I was packing away old clothes for donation, I found a journal. Not just any journal. It was the one I had kept in my early 30s, before the kids, before the compromises, before the routine had swallowed me whole. I sat down on the edge of the bed and started to read. Page after page, I saw a version of myself I had forgotten. A woman who loved poetry, who wanted to learn Italian, who dreamed of walking along cobbled streets in another country with no plan and no timeline. A woman who once wrote, "I want to be free, even if freedom means being alone." Tears slipped down my cheeks, but they weren't sad tears. They were grateful. That night, I booked a flight to Florence. Not Paris, Florence. It wasn't impulsive. It was overdue. Laura was shocked, but thrilled. Denise called me 3 times to say how proud she was. Even my son, who had moved across the country and rarely called, sent a message saying, "Mom, that's amazing. You deserve this." And I believed him. The flight was long, and the city was unfamiliar. But when I stepped out of the taxi and into the golden light of a Florence morning, something inside me clicked. It felt like I had come home, not to a place, but to myself. I stayed in a tiny apartment above a bakery. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread and coffee floated through my window. I spent my days walking the narrow streets, listening to the lilt of a language I didn't understand but somehow felt in my soul. I visited museums, sat in parks, and once, on a whim, I joined a local poetry reading in a candlelit cafe. I didn't read, not yet, but I listened. I let the words wash over me. One evening, I was sitting by the Arno River, watching the sun dip behind the buildings, when an older woman sat beside me. She had silver hair and wore a scarf with tiny embroidered flowers. We didn't speak the same language, but she smiled at me, handed me a small flower from her basket, and nodded. That silent exchange said more than any words could. It reminded me of who I had become. A woman who had been left behind, yes, but who had risen, beautifully, from the ashes of abandonment. Back home, Mark sent one last letter. It was shorter than the others. "I saw a photo of you in Florence online. You looked happy. I never made you look like that. I hope someday I can forgive myself for what I did to you." I folded the letter and placed it with the others. Not out of bitterness, not even as a warning, but as a record. A reminder that healing doesn't always come from revenge or from new love. Sometimes it comes from remembering who you were before someone taught you to forget. As the months passed, I made peace with more than just the past. I forgave myself for staying too long, for shrinking to fit, for loving someone who didn't know how to love me back. And I realized something beautiful. At 64, I wasn't starting over. I was finally beginning. Returning home from Florence wasn't easy. The quiet of my old house felt louder now. The furniture stood where I'd left it, frozen in time. But I was different. I didn't walk the same. I didn't carry the weight of what happened like a sack over my shoulders anymore. I had left parts of my pain along those cobbled Italian streets. I had picked up strength in little cafes and painted it onto my skin like sunlight. But life doesn't wait for you to get back. Bills were stacked in the same drawer. My fridge hummed the same old hum. Even the garden, wild and unkempt now, waited for my hands. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. Not out of duty, but out of purpose. I joined a local library group for women over 60. I thought I'd be the quiet one in the back. But something strange happened. I found myself telling stories about Florence, about rebuilding, about how I stared down betrayal and didn't blink. They listened, not with pity, but with admiration. These women knew pain, divorce, death, distance, regret. But they also knew how to start again. One of them, Margaret, had been a nurse for 40 years. She said to me, Honey, you don't patch a broken heart with words. You stitch it with choices. That line stuck with me, so I made more choices. I turned the guest room into a writing space. No more neutral colors. I painted the walls pale blue, the color of calm. I opened the windows and let in the air. I started writing again. At first, little journal entries, then short essays, and then, one day, I started a memoir. It wasn't for revenge or to shame anyone. It was for me. A love letter to the woman I'd become. A record of everything I had survived without applause. And then something happened I never expected. A small publisher from New Hampshire, run by Women for Women, reached out. One of their editors had attended a community reading where I'd shared a piece of my story. She said my words made her cry, not because they were sad, but because they were honest. Raw. They wanted to publish a collection. I stared at that email for a long time before replying. The same fingers that had once shaken while texting Mark now typed out, "I'd be honored." The day the book arrived in the mail, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my name on the cover. Not as Mark's wife. Not as the woman who got left behind. Just my name. It was surreal. That night, I held the book in my lap and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to the world. For not letting me disappear. For giving me time to remember who I was. Then came the strangest twist of all. 6 months later, I received a letter, handwritten, from a woman named Kelsey. She wrote, "I don't know how to begin, so I'll start with the truth. I was the 20-year-old girl in Los Angeles. I was the one your husband left you for." My heart paused. I was young, stupid, and flattered by attention I didn't understand. But I never knew the whole story. I thought you'd cheated. He told me things that weren't true. I believed him, and I'm sorry for that. I left him a year later. He was cold, angry, always looking back, never forward. She went on to say she'd found my book by accident in a small bookstore and realized who I was halfway through the 3rd chapter. I wept. Not for him, for you, and for how much of myself I lost in the mess. She ended the letter with this, "Thank you for writing your story. It made me realize the difference between being chosen and being respected. I hope you find everything he never gave you. You deserve it." I sat for a long time after finishing that letter. Strangely, I didn't hate her. I didn't feel anger. All I felt was this profound sense of release. Not everything in life comes full circle, but sometimes the most unexpected closure arrives when you've stopped waiting for it. That night, I slept without a single dream. No memories, no past knocking at the door, just stillness, just peace. And I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of the chapter I should have written long ago, but needed to live first. A year passed. Not quietly, but gracefully. The woman who once stared blankly at a blinking text message from her husband had become someone she could be proud of. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened through slow mornings, quiet growth, and small victories that no one else clapped for. But she did, in her own way. I remember sitting by the window one morning, sipping coffee, watching the sunlight dance on the floor. That same window where I once sat frozen, the day Mark told me he was leaving. But this time, the silence felt soft, peaceful. No weight on my chest, no tears behind my eyes. That's when it hit me. I had survived not just his betrayal, but the part of myself that once believed I couldn't live without him. One day, out of the blue, Mark showed up at my door. His hair was thinner, his eyes tired. He didn't look like the man who once walked out laughing with a 20-year-old. He looked like someone who had finally seen the damage he'd left behind. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stood there quietly for a moment, then stepped aside. Not because I wanted him back, God no, but because I was no longer afraid of facing him. We sat in the living room. Two people who once shared a life, now sharing nothing but silence and history. He apologized, genuinely, for the cruelty, for the betrayal, for taking everything and giving nothing back. "I thought I wanted freedom," he said. "Turns out, I just didn't want to feel small. But I made you small instead." I nodded, not because it changed anything, but because I understood something now. People hurt others when they don't know how to love themselves. I told him I forgave him, not for him, but for me. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back in. It means letting the pain walk out. As he left, he turned back at the door. "You're glowing," he said. I smiled. "That's what peace looks like." And it was. I spent my days mentoring women now, especially those who believed life ended after 50, 60, or even 70. I told them, we are not leftovers. We are not used-up stories. We are beginnings waiting to happen. My little book went on to reach more women than I could have imagined. Letters poured in, women who had been left, silenced, forgotten, telling me they finally felt seen, that they had packed a suitcase and started again, that they wore red lipstick for the first time in years, that they danced alone in their kitchens. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming our voices, our value, our space in this world that often overlooks women past a certain age. And if you, dear listener, have ever been told you're too old to begin again, let me tell you something from a woman who was left with nothing but an empty bank account and a broken heart. You are not too late. You are not too old. You are not done. Life begins the moment you decide your worth is no longer up for negotiation. So stand up, speak your truth, and walk forward, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to yourself that you were always right to believe you still matter, because you do. We all do. And that, my dear friends, is how I found myself, after losing everything, not in a fairy tale, but in real life. Right here, where healing finally had room to grow.